Imagine a man standing at the edge of a ruined city, tears streaming down his face. This man isn't just crying over the physical destruction he sees around him. He's weeping for something much deeper. This is Jeremiah, the prophet known as the Weeping Prophet. But don't be mistaken. Jeremiah's tears weren't a sign of weakness, and he wasn't just an overly emotional person. His tears came from a pain that transcended personal suffering. Jeremiah wept because he saw the spiritual reality of God's people. He saw their hardened hearts, distant from the Creator. He wept because he knew what was coming: the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of his people, and the devastation of everything they knew. Jeremiah was called to a difficult mission. From a young age, he bore the weight of a message of judgment, and with that responsibility came loneliness. He not only had to face rejection from the people, but also had to wrestle with his own heart, torn between love for his people and faithfulness to God's message. Now, imagine the despair. Jeremiah wasn't just prophesying destruction. He knew that God also grieved over the hardness of his people's hearts. It was as if Jeremiah felt God's own emotions, and that's why his tears were so deep and painful. The people laughed at him, ignored his words, but Jeremiah, even in the midst of mockery and rejection, kept going. Every tear he shed was a silent cry of warning and, at the same time, compassion. Jeremiah didn't just weep for what was happening in the present. He wept for the future he saw so clearly, a future of pain but also of hope. He knew that behind the impending judgment, there was a promise of restoration, and that God's broken heart, reflected in his tears, was ultimately filled with love for his people. So, when you look at Jeremiah's tears, don't just see the suffering. See the depth of a man who dared to feel the weight of divine sorrow, who wept because he understood God's heart. A heart that broke not for the destruction itself, but for the hope of future redemption. And thus, Jeremiah's tears continue to remind us, it's not weakness that makes someone cry for what's right. It's the strength of a heart that loves deeply, even when the world around seems to be falling apart. But Jeremiah's tears weren't only for others. There was a constant internal struggle within him, a deep conflict between his faith and his doubts. He was a flesh and blood man, just like any of us, and in many moments he questioned his own calling. Imagine being sent to deliver a message no one wants to hear, being rejected, persecuted, treated like an outcast, and still having to keep going. In his brutal honesty, Jeremiah opened his heart to God. He didn't hide his pain or frustration. Sometimes he even accused God of deceiving him. "You deceived me, Lord," he said during one of the most intense moments of his life. It was as if Jeremiah was saying, "I didn't know it would be like this. I didn't know being faithful to you would mean so much suffering." But at the same time, even with those strong words, he never completely walked away. There was a tension, a desire to give up, to leave it all behind. Yet something held him back from abandoning his mission. This internal struggle is what makes Jeremiah so human. He wasn't a perfect, unshakable hero. He was vulnerable, and in his vulnerability, we see the depth of his relationship with God. His faith wasn't blind. It was a faith tested, refined in the fire of doubts and hardships. At times, Jeremiah even said he would no longer speak in God's name. He was tired, emotionally and spiritually exhausted. But as he confessed, God's word was like fire in his bones. He couldn't contain it no matter how much he wanted to. There was something stronger inside him, something that pushed him to continue, even when everything seemed lost. And it's in this struggle between faith and doubt that we see Jeremiah's greatness. He shows us that it's possible to be honest with God, to express our pain, our fears, our frustrations, without it diminishing our faith. Because true faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's the courage to keep trusting, even when everything inside us wants to stop. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, was also the prophet who fought, not against visible enemies, but against internal ones: fear, loneliness, doubt. And in that internal battle, he discovered that faithfulness to God doesn't come from an innate supernatural strength, but from a deep dependence on the one who had called him from his mother's womb. And so, even amidst the chaos of his emotions, Jeremiah pressed on, crying, yes, lamenting, yes, but always faithful, because, in the end, he knew that behind his tears and struggles, God was with him, sustaining him every step of his difficult journey. And it was exactly this dependence on God, this strength that came from outside, that allowed Jeremiah to keep going. Because from the very beginning, he knew he wasn't capable. He knew he was weak, insecure, too young. Do you remember how it all started? Jeremiah, still a young man, tried to avoid God's call. He said, "I'm too young, Lord. I don't know how to speak." But God doesn't choose the qualified. He qualifies those he chooses. God looked at that insecure young man and said, "Don't say you're too young. You will go wherever I send you, and you will speak whatever I command you." And at that moment, God touched Jeremiah's mouth. He placed his words in the prophet's mouth. God's words became the strength Jeremiah needed because, on his own, he wouldn't have gotten anywhere. Jeremiah didn't have any special training, wasn't a natural leader, and didn't have the eloquence of great speakers. He wasn't known for his ability to convince or persuade. But God chose him precisely because of that. Because the mission wouldn't be fulfilled through human talent, but by God's power. Jeremiah just needed to be the vessel. And what a fragile vessel he was. But it was in that fragile vessel that God would place his most powerful message. Throughout Jeremiah's journey, we see that every time he felt incapable, every time he questioned his own worth, God lifted him up, putting his words in his mouth once again. The message wasn't Jeremiah's, it never was. It was God's. And that made all the difference. There's something deeply liberating about that. Jeremiah, like us, didn't need to be perfect, didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to be up to the task. He just needed to be willing. Willing to keep going, to speak, to move forward, even when everything seemed to be falling apart around him. And that's one of the most powerful lessons from his story. God doesn't call us because we're the best, the most prepared, or the most capable. He calls us in spite of our weaknesses. And it's precisely through those weaknesses that he shows his strength. Jeremiah learned this. He learned that, even in his moments of deepest doubt and fear, the ability to carry out his mission didn't come from him, but from the God who had called him. And no matter how young and inexperienced he was, God had already equipped him from the beginning. It was this divine equipping that set Jeremiah on a collision course with the powerful. Because when you carry God's message, you can't please everyone. Jeremiah wasn't called to speak comforting words, but hard truths, and those truths made a lot of people uncomfortable. From the beginning, he had to face kings, priests, and false prophets, all committed to maintaining a facade of security and prosperity. They told the people, "Everything is fine. God is with us. Nothing bad will happen to us." But Jeremiah, with the boldness that could only come from God, stood up and said the opposite. "You're deceiving yourselves. Destruction is at the door." He spoke out against King Jehoiakim, who burned the words of his prophecies in a fireplace, trying to literally erase God's message. He spoke against corrupt priests who lied to the people in exchange for prestige and influence. And, perhaps most dangerously of all, he confronted the false prophets who proclaimed peace when judgment was coming. Jeremiah denounced them publicly, calling them liars and deceivers. These were the people in power who controlled the narrative, who manipulated the people's faith for their own interests. To them, Jeremiah wasn't just a nuisance, he was a direct threat. And threats need to be silenced. And so, the conspiracies to eliminate him began. Priests and false prophets grabbed him in the temple, shouting that he should die for daring to say that Jerusalem would be destroyed. Imagine the scene. An angry crowd surrounding him, threatening his life, and Jeremiah standing there, alone, holding on to only the certainty of what God had said. He knew he wasn't welcome. He knew his message wouldn't be received. but still he proclaimed it. And even so, despite all the opposition, Jeremiah didn't give in. He didn't change his message to please, didn't soften his words to gain favor. He knew that his commitment wasn't to men, but to God. And that commitment required courage, a courage that went beyond what he could have on his own. That courage wasn't the result of a strong personality or unshakable confidence. Jeremiah was fragile, as we've seen, but his strength came from knowing that even when facing kings and religious leaders, he had something no one could take from him: the truth. The truth that God was with him, guiding every word, protecting him, even in the most desperate situations. And so, Jeremiah became the voice no one wanted to hear, but that everyone needed to listen to. He challenged the system, challenged the powerful, and for that he paid a high price. But his courage, sustained by God, never wavered. And when words weren't enough, God had Jeremiah speak through symbolic actions. Because sometimes people don't listen to the message until it becomes visible, tangible, something they can see and understand in a more concrete way. One of these actions was the famous episode of the linen belt. God told Jeremiah to wear a new belt, a symbol of purity and closeness, and then bury it near a river, where it stayed abandoned for a while. When Jeremiah dug it up, the belt was completely ruined, useless. It was then that the prophet, through this image, revealed to the people that their pride was rotting, just like the belt. They had lost their usefulness to God, corrupted by idolatry and hypocrisy. But it didn't stop there. On another occasion, God took Jeremiah to the house of a potter. There, the prophet watched the craftsman shaping a pot. In the middle of the process, the pot became deformed in the potter's hands, and without hesitation, the potter smashed it and began again. Jeremiah used this powerful scene to show the people that God could do the same with them. If they continued hardening their hearts, he would destroy them, but he was also willing to remake them if they repented. The people were like clay in God's hands, moldable but also susceptible to being broken if necessary. These symbolic acts were more than simple dramatizations. They were powerful reminders that God's message wasn't just about words, but about real consequences. Jeremiah was trying to open the eyes of a stubborn people, using every possible means to communicate the urgency of the situation. But, of course, these visual messages weren't well received. They challenged the people's comfort, exposed the fragility of their lives, and revealed the truth no one wanted to face. Seeing the ruined belt or the broken pot wasn't just a spectacle but a clear warning. If they didn't change, they would be destroyed. Jeremiah walked the streets with these living messages, carrying the weight of a God who not only spoke but showed. He became, in many moments, the embodiment of God's warning. A prophet who, even in the face of mockery and scorn, used every action, every gesture, to cry out to the people that time was running out. And so, through powerful symbols, Jeremiah tried to make the blind see. He tried desperately to show his people that while judgment was certain, there was still time to turn back, to be remade in the hands of the Creator. But, as so often happens, even the clearest signs can be ignored by those who don't want to see. Yet, in the midst of all these messages of destruction and judgment, something surprising emerged. Jeremiah, the prophet who warned so much, was also the bearer of an almost unbelievable hope: the promise of a new covenant. Imagine that for a moment. Jeremiah, who had spoken so much about the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the exile of the people, now delivered a prophecy that seemed to contradict everything he had set up until then. In the middle of the darkness, he spoke of a light, a future where God would do something radically new. Jeremiah announced that the covenant between God and the people would be restored, but not in the same way. He prophesied a new covenant, one that wouldn't be written on stone tablets, like Moses' covenant, but engraved on people's hearts. God said that they would no longer need intermediaries to know him, for all people, from the least to the greatest, would know him directly. It was a message of restoration, of a personal and intimate relationship with God, without the barriers that had existed before. God promised not only to forgive the people's sins but to forget them completely. It was a complete renewal, a second chance offered even after so many warnings and so many mistakes. And this new covenant wasn't something distant, something vague. It was a promise that Jeremiah conveyed with a depth that touched the hearts of those who still listened. Despite the impending destruction, despite the chaos that would come, God had not abandoned his people. He was planning something much greater, something that Jeremiah not only understood but carried with him as a living hope. Jeremiah didn't proclaim this promise in a triumphalist way. He knew that the road to this new covenant would be difficult, filled with pain and loss. But it was this promise that sustained his heart. In the midst of his tears, in the midst of his anguish and confessions, this hope drove him to keep going. He knew that even when the people strayed, even when everything seemed lost, God wouldn't give up on Israel. The destruction was necessary, but it wasn't the end. There would be a renewal, a new kind of relationship between God and his people. And no matter how distant that seemed at the time, Jeremiah trusted that this new covenant would come and would bring with it a restoration that no human power could stop. And so, the prophet who wept so much over the coming disaster also became the herald of a grand hope. A hope that went beyond the ruins, beyond the exile, and pointed to a future of renewal, where God would be closer than ever. But even with the promise of a new covenant, Jeremiah's journey was far from easy. While hope sustained his heart, the path toward it was filled with real dangers, and the opposition against him grew stronger every day. Jeremiah wasn't just an unpopular prophet, he was a marked man, a target for death. And that mark came directly from the authorities, the religious leaders, and the powerful. They saw him as a threat, someone undermining the people's confidence, someone speaking of surrender to the enemy, someone announcing the destruction of everything they held sacred. Jeremiah was at war, but not with swords and shields. His battle was fought with words. Words that, for many, were unbearable. The persecution reached a point where they tried to silence him once and for all. The officials of Judah were fed up. They accused him of demoralizing the soldiers and the people, of breaking the spirit of those still fighting to resist Babylon. And that's when Jeremiah faced one of the darkest moments of his life. They seized him and threw him into a cistern. Now imagine that. An empty cistern, but not dry, full of mud. They threw him in to die slowly, sinking into the mud, with no food, no water, alone. The one who had cried out to the crowds was now trapped in a dark hole, left to be forgotten. Jeremiah, the prophet who never stopped speaking, was now silenced by mud and the weight of persecution. There, slowly sinking, he must have thought that his end had finally come. After years of facing mockery, rejection, and threats, maybe he imagined that God had allowed his suffering to end. But God wasn't done with him yet. Then, an unexpected savior appeared. Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian official, heard what had happened. He could have ignored it like so many others. He could have stayed silent. But he didn't. He went to King Zedekiah, risking his own position and reputation, and pleaded for Jeremiah. He convinced the king to let him rescue the prophet. And so, with the help of a few men, Ebed-Melech used ropes and old rags to pull Jeremiah out of the muddy cistern. It was an act of mercy, but also of courage. Jeremiah was saved, but he wasn't out of danger. The persecution would continue. The hatred against him wouldn't disappear. But this rescue showed that even in the most desperate moments, God was still with him, providing help from the most unexpected places. Jeremiah wasn't spared from suffering, but he was never abandoned. Even when it seemed like everything was lost, God always provided a way out. And that, perhaps, was what kept Jeremiah standing through it all. The certainty that no matter how terrible the persecution, he was never truly alone. But then came the moment Jeremiah had feared, the fulfillment of his prophecies. Jerusalem fell. The Babylonian army invaded. The city was destroyed, and the temple, the center of the people's religious and spiritual life, was reduced to rubble. Everything Jeremiah had warned about came true, and there was no victory, no miraculous rescue. Jerusalem lay in ruins. Imagine the weight of that on Jeremiah. He had spent years warning the people, begging them to repent, to listen to God. And now, he found himself in the midst of the devastation he had prophesied. What did he feel at that moment? Was there any relief in knowing that he had been right? No, because the truth is, no matter how accurate his words were, Jeremiah didn't rejoice in the destruction. He wept even more. Even with the fall of Jerusalem, Jeremiah's suffering wasn't over. He could have been taken into captivity like so many others, but something surprising happened. King Nebuchadnezzar himself, the ruler of Babylon, gave orders for Jeremiah to be treated with respect. Imagine that. The enemy who had destroyed his nation, who had laid waste to his city, ordered that he be well cared for. Jeremiah was brought before a Babylonian commander, and unlike the others who were taken as prisoners, he was given the choice to go to Babylon or stay in Judah with the remnant. And Jeremiah, faithful to the end, chose to stay. He chose to remain with the people who were left, those few who had not been exiled. Even in the midst of the devastation, he wouldn't abandon his calling. Now, think about the depth of that moment. Jeremiah could have gone to Babylon, could have found some relief, a new life, away from all the suffering he had endured. But he chose to stay, because, for him, the mission didn't end with the fall of the city. There were still people to comfort, a remnant to encourage. They needed to know that even with the destruction of Jerusalem, God was still with them. That choice reveals the essence of Jeremiah's heart. He wasn't driven by revenge, nor by pride. He was deeply committed to the spiritual well-being of the people, even after everything that had happened. The destruction didn't bring him any satisfaction. What he wanted most was for the people to understand that even in their pain, there was still a chance for redemption, for rebuilding, a new covenant, a new beginning. And so Jeremiah stayed, not as a triumphant prophet, but as a humble servant who, even after the fulfillment of his harshest words, continued to serve, to love, and to guide the people who had so often rejected him. Because, in the end, the hope he carried wasn't just for a distant future, but for those who had survived and could still turn their hearts back to God. Even after all of this, Jeremiah's rejection didn't end. Although he chose to stay in Judah to comfort the remnant, not everyone was willing to hear what he had to say. Many still saw his words as a burden, something they preferred to avoid. And it was in this moment of extreme fragility for the people that the false prophets emerged once again. These false prophets, always ready to say what the people wanted to hear, began proclaiming a message different from Jeremiah's. They claimed that Babylon would soon be defeated, that the people of Judah should rise up and resist, that God's covenant with them would still protect them. These were comforting words, but they were completely false. Jeremiah, as always, knew the truth was far harsher. God had already spoken. Babylon was his instrument of judgment. There was no glory in resisting. The path to survival was submission, acceptance of exile. But who wanted to hear that? Who wanted to accept that the only chance for survival was to surrender to what seemed like total defeat? And this is where the conflict between Jeremiah and the false prophets reached its peak. They proclaimed hope where there was no real hope. They preached peace when war was at the doorstep. And the people, desperate for any word that would ease their pain, preferred to believe them rather than face the harsh reality Jeremiah was bringing. In one of the most iconic confrontations, a false prophet named Hananiah took the wooden yoke Jeremiah was wearing on his shoulders, a symbol of submission to Babylon, and broke it, declaring that God would break the yoke of Babylon within 2 years. The people cheered. Finally, someone was saying what they wanted to hear, but Jeremiah, always faithful to the truth, looked at Hananiah and, with a voice firm and filled with divine authority, said, "You broke a wooden yoke, but in its place, God will put a yoke of iron." He knew that Hananiah's words were not from God, And so he declared that the false prophet would die that same year for lying and leading the people into rebellion against the Lord. And that's exactly what happened. This conflict between hard truth and comforting lies was something Jeremiah faced throughout his life. He knew that the truth was often not what people wanted to hear, but it was what they needed. The false prophets offered cheap comfort, an empty hope that only led the people into more suffering. Jeremiah, on the other hand, offered the truth, a difficult truth, yes, but one that could eventually lead to restoration. And it was this courage to say what no one wanted to hear that made Jeremiah so misunderstood, so rejected, yet so faithful to his calling. Even when surrounded by pleasant lies, he chose the truth, no matter the cost. And so, in the midst of desolation, rejection, and the constant battle against false prophets, Jeremiah reached the end of his mission. He had witnessed the destruction he had long prophesied, faced kings and priests, false leaders, and the scorn of his own people. But even after all of this, Jeremiah did not give up. He knew that despite all appearances, God was still in control. This was his comfort in the midst of chaos, the certainty that, no matter how irreversibly lost the circumstances seemed, God had never abandoned his people. Jerusalem lay in ruins, the temple destroyed, the people exiled, but God was still working. In their hearts, in his promises, in history. And this is what Jeremiah tried to communicate until the very end. God's judgment always has a greater purpose. It's not an end in itself. It's the pathway to restoration. The pain, the exile, the destruction, all of it was part of a much deeper plan. A plan aimed not only at punishing but transforming, redeeming, bringing his people back to the path of justice and a true relationship with God. Jeremiah, in all his moments of anguish and loneliness, never lost sight of this vision. He knew that God allowed judgment so that one day he could bring renewal. And this vision of a future restoration was what sustained him. Even when the people ignored his words, even when he was thrown into a cistern to die, even when false prophets contradicted him, Jeremiah clung to the promise that God's work was not finished. There would be a new covenant. The people would return to their land. God would restore everything that had been lost, and they would know him in a way they had never known him before. This unshakable trust in God's plan, even when everything seemed out of control, is what allowed Jeremiah to keep going until the end. He knew that even when people failed, when leaders failed, God never failed. And that truth was enough for him. In the end, Jeremiah's story is not just a story of judgment. It's a story of hope. A hope that wasn't based on circumstances, but on God's faithfulness. A hope that refused to die, even when everything around seemed to collapse. And so, until his last breath, Jeremiah remained faithful. He had lived through the reality of a destroyed city and an exiled people, but he knew that the future promised by God was full of redemption. God didn't just bring judgment, he brought restoration. And that was the deepest truth that sustained Jeremiah. In the end, God always brings healing.